The Isleweaver update is showing just how narrow Warframe's real weapon pool is. On paper, the game has hundreds of weapons, but when you're facing enemies with damage attenuation, most of them fall flat. Isleweaver highlights this more than ever. The random weapon system forces players to use gear they might never touch otherwise, and for many, that's when it hits. You realize over 80% of your arsenal just doesn't work against attenuated targets. Not because it's unmodded or weak, it's just not built to fight a system that crushes damage. If you've played Isleweaver, you've probably felt it during the Oraxia and fragmented boss fights. These bosses both have attenuation, but in different ways. Oraxia's is manageable. You can work around it with decent multi-hit weapons. But the fragmented? It's a mess if you get the wrong gear. The fight is on a timer, and if your weapons can't keep up, you're just waiting around. It's not about how good your mods are, it's about whether the system allows your hits to matter. And when it doesn't, the fight drags. The issue isn't just the RNG weapon rolls. The real problem is how few weapons actually work in these fights. You can mod them well, play smart, and still lose tons of time because attenuation shuts your damage down. And when the fallback options like the arch gun are weaker than the random trash you rolled, it feels even worse. That's exactly what happened in one solo run, where the arch gun, supposedly the pity option, did less damage than my amp. At that point, it's not a challenge, it's just annoying. This doesn't mean the update is bad. Isleweaver is actually fun and offers great rewards. The new pistols are unique, and the alt path for clamps is a welcome change. Oraxia's fight is enjoyable and feels fair, but none of that changes the fact that attenuation is exposing a long-standing issue. So many weapons are just not viable in certain fights, and the only reason we're noticing now is because Isleweaver forces us to use them. If not for the random loadouts, we'd probably keep ignoring most of our inventory. It's not about RNG, it's about design. If over half the weapons in the game aren't worth using when attenuation is active, something's off. Players don't expect every weapon to be meta, but they should at least feel useful. Right now, the only way to deal with attenuation is to rely on very specific tools. Fast multi-hit weapons, high-status setups, or damage over time effects. That leaves a huge chunk of gear behind. And when you're forced to use that gear in Isleweaver, it becomes painfully clear how deep that problem runs. Fights like the Fragmented show how bad it can get. You're on a timer, locked into gear you didn't choose, and expected to keep up with a system that deletes your damage. It's not hard, it's just slow. There's no engagement, no tension, no learning. You already know how to mod and aim. You just don't have the right tool for the job, and you can't switch mid-mission. That turns what could be a great fight into a slog, where you're waiting more than fighting. Isleweaver is a great event, but it's also a mirror. It's showing us how fragile Warframe's weapon balance really is under the weight of attenuation. Most players are fine with some weapons being better than others. But when entire categories of gear become dead weight in key fights, something needs to change. If Digital Extremes wants fights to feel fair and fun, they need to either improve how attenuation works, or start looking at how many weapons are being left behind because of it. Damage attenuation in Warframe is a hidden system that lowers how much damage you can do to certain enemies. You'll usually notice it when your strongest builds deal tiny amounts of damage to specific targets. The system doesn't care about your crits, status effects, or buffs. It simply reduces the number based on how strong the hit is. The higher your damage, the harder the reduction. This isn't the same as armor or shields. It's a scripted mechanic used to stop players from instantly killing powerful enemies or skipping boss phases. You'll mostly run into damage attenuation in boss fights or special enemies with scripted events. Some examples include Archons, Colorvo, Steelpath Demolists, and sentient bosses from the New War. These fights are designed to feel longer and harder. If DE let players use their usual damage setups, these enemies would die too fast. Attenuation makes sure they last long enough for the fight to feel like a challenge. That's why this system is not used on regular enemies. It's only there for fights where pacing matters. The way attenuation works is based on how much damage you deal in a single hit. There is no official formula, but testing shows the game checks each hit's value and applies scaling. Hits below a certain number may pass through normally, but if the damage is too high, it gets squashed down to a much lower number. For example, a 2 million damage hit might only deal 5,000 actual damage. In some fights, damage attenuation scales down more when you use AoE, crits, or big ability combos. The exact numbers vary by enemy. One of the worst cases of damage attenuation is in the Isleweaver fight. Even medium damage weapons can feel useless there. Players found that fast multi-hit weapons or damage over time effects work better. That's because the game doesn't squash many small hits as hard as one big hit. The Archon fights are also well known for this. Their resistance to big attacks forces players to use builds that spread out damage. It's not about huge numbers, it's about dealing steady, consistent damage that gets past the system. There are a few ways to deal with attenuation, but you can't remove it completely. Weapons that apply status effects like slash or heat can help. These effects do damage over time, which isn't reduced as much. High fire rate weapons also help since the system doesn't crush smaller hits as hard. You can also bring support frames like Wisp, Rhino, or Mirage to boost total output, but don't waste time chasing huge red crits. That kind of setup often works worse in these fights. Why does Digital Extremes use this system at all? It's mainly to control the flow of boss fights. Players are extremely powerful, and DE knows it. Without damage attenuation, many fights would last just a few seconds. That would break scripted moments, voice lines, or arena mechanics. Instead of giving enemies a billion health, DE uses attenuation to slow things down without making bosses feel like damage sponges. It's not perfect, but it gives the devs more control over how fights play out. In the end, damage attenuation forces you to think differently. You can't rely on your usual one-shot everything loadout. You need to switch to gear that hit often or spreads damage out. If your build feels weak in a boss fight, that doesn't mean your gear is bad. It means the system is active. Learn how it works, adjust your playstyle, and you'll get through the fight faster than just stacking more power. It's not about damage numbers, it's about how that damage is delivered. But the real question, though, is it really makes the boss fights in Warframe challenging, or they get more annoying? Now, I want to be honest with you guys. As a long-time Warframe player, I see damage attenuation as more of a problem than a solution. On paper, it's supposed to make boss fights last longer and feel more balanced, but in practice, it just drags out battles without making them more fun. Instead of fighting a smart enemy, you're fighting a damage wall. Your high-powered builds suddenly feel weak for no good reason. It doesn't feel like you're being tested. It just feels like the game is holding you back on purpose. The biggest complaint is that damage attenuation doesn't add any real difficulty. It just stretches the fight. Bosses don't move smarter. They don't use better tactics. They just soak up damage while repeating the same patterns. Players want bosses that challenge their skill, not their patience. When a fight lasts 10 minutes because your damage is being crushed, that's not exciting. It's frustrating. It turns a boss battle into a chore. Players also feel like their time is being wasted. In normal missions, your builds feel powerful and rewarding, but in an attenuated boss fight, all that power means nothing. It doesn't matter how much you optimized your gear or mod setup. The game says no and reduces your damage anyway. This kills the feeling of progress. You're not beating the boss because you played smart. You're just waiting for the system to let you win. What makes it worse is that most attenuated fights aren't even engaging. Take Isleweaver or the Archons. Once you learn their basic moves, they don't offer much variety. The fight doesn't change or get harder. You're just doing the same thing over and over while watching small chunks of their health disappear. That kind of design doesn't push players to improve. It pushes them to bring better fire rate, more status, or just run the fight with friends to speed it up. The damage attenuation system also confuses new players. They enter a boss fight with a strong build, expecting it to perform. When it doesn't, they assume they built wrong or something broke. They search forums, only to find out it's not their fault, it's just scripted that way. This makes the system feel unfair and poorly explained. If the goal is to make fights longer, then the game should be clearer about why damage suddenly feels so weak. Some players have offered better ideas. They suggest making bosses more mobile, giving them unique mechanics, or forcing players to react to changing attacks. Others want stagger phases, weak spots, or puzzle-like parts that reward timing and teamwork. These options can make fights harder in a fun way, not just by giving enemies more resistance. Right now, damage attenuation feels lazy. It's a shortcut to fake difficulty, and players notice that. At the end of the day, damage attenuation needs a rework. It shouldn't punish players for building strong gear. It should push them to use it in smarter ways. Right now, it just stretches boss fights without adding any excitement. That's not challenge, it's padding. If Digital Extremes wants players to enjoy these fights, the solution isn't to stop their damage. The solution is to make the fights worth playing, not just worth surviving.
She's vanished for now, but she'll climb back.